Hey everyone, I've been really looking forward to this one. We're diving into a topic that's always fascinated me, monasteries. And you guys sent in some amazing source material for this. We've got historical accounts, architectural plans, even some novels set in monasteries.
It's a great mix, yeah. And, looking at it all, it seems like you're interested in more than just the buildings themselves.
Right, like what does it actually mean to live that monastic life?
Exactly. What goes on behind those walls?
Okay, well, let's start with the word monastery itself.
Okay.
I was reading that it comes from the Greek word for to live alone,
Mm-hmm.
which seems kind of strange, right? Because when I think of monasteries, I think of community.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is a little counterintuitive. It actually reflects how the idea of monasticism evolved over time.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about the early figures who sought a spiritual life. People like Anthony the Great, the Desert Fathers, they were solitary.
Right, seeking isolation in the Egyptian wilderness.
Exactly. But even in solitude, there's a need for basic support. Food, care when you're sick, that kind of thing.
It makes sense. You can't completely isolate yourself from everything.
Right. And so over time, those seeking a similar path naturally formed loose communities.
Supporting each other in their spiritual journey.
Yeah, exactly. And as those communities grew, they needed a bit more structure. And
Hmm.
that's how we start to see the development of what we now recognize as monasteries.
So it's like from hermits to organized communities.
Exactly. And one of the best early examples of this is something you sent in, the Plan of St. Gall.
Yeah, that ninth century plan for a proposed monastery. It's so detailed.
It is incredible, isn't it? And what I find fascinating about it is how self-sufficient it was designed to be. They really thought of everything, the church, workshops, a farm,
Mhm.
all within those walls.
A whole little world unto itself.
Yeah, dedicated to a higher purpose.
So, okay, you've got all that organization and planning.
Yeah.
But how did these places actually survive?
Well, there were a few ways. Alms from the faithful were definitely important.
Right, people donating to support the monks.
Exactly. But beyond that, these communities were really resourceful. Many monasteries cultivated land, becoming quite skilled in agriculture.
Wow, like self-sustaining farms.
Yeah, very much so. Some even produced goods like beer or crafts, which they would sell for income.
Wow, so not just farming, but actually generating income.
Right. And even today, you see monasteries adapting. Some offer services like accounting or even software development.
Really? That's amazing. That combination of spiritual dedication and worldly practicality is so fascinating.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that gives us a glimpse into the Christian monastery, at least in Europe.
Uh-huh.
But you sent in sources on monasteries from all over the world, from different religions.
Yeah, there's a lot to explore.
So what about those? What can you tell us about monasteries in, say, Buddhism?
Well, that's a great place to start. Did you know the origins of Buddhist monasteries can be traced back to the rainy season retreats? They're called vasa. Basically, during monsoon season, wandering monks would need shelter.
That makes sense. You can't wander around in a monsoon.
Exactly. And over time, these temporary shelters evolved into more permanent structures.
So the monasteries grew out of necessity.
In a way, yeah. And in some parts of Southeast Asia, monks still follow that rhythm. They retreat to monasteries during the rains.
It's amazing how those ancient traditions continue today. But what about those forest monasteries dedicated to meditation?
Right.
They seem so different. Almost like those early Christian hermits seeking solitude.
Yes, they do often represent a more contemplative side of Buddhism, but even those tranquil spaces aren't immune to the modern world.
What do you mean?
Well, as development encroaches, many are struggling to maintain their secluded
Oh,
existence.
right. It's like those peaceful retreats are being squeezed by the modern world.
Unfortunately, yes.
Hmm. That makes me think of something else I came across in the sources. The Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. I even saw the term lamasery used.
Ah, yes. Well, the more accurate term is Gompa. Yeah. Lamasery was a term adopted by groups like the Theosophical Society for their meeting places. It's kind of a historical quirk.
A quirk, but interesting. Shows how these terms and ideas travel in unexpected ways.
It does.
Okay, let's go back to Christian monasticism for a minute. One source pointed to a really interesting possible influence on how monasteries were structured. Roman army barracks.
Oh, yeah. That's fascinating.
Right. The source talked about how Pachomius, who really formalized that communal monastic life, was a former Roman soldier.
It makes you wonder if that structured, hierarchical military environment shaped his thinking.
It's definitely food for thought. And from what I read, those early Egyptian monasteries were massive, huge.
They were. Nitria, sometimes called the Holy City, was home to something like 50,000 monks at its peak.
50,000. Wow. That's a whole monastic city.
A testament to the appeal of this way of life back then.
Yeah, it is. But this monastic movement didn't stay confined to Egypt, did it?
No, not at all. The concept spread rapidly. Athanasius brought the idea to Europe, Mar Auden established communities in Mesopotamia, and Mar Saba founded what's considered the mother of Eastern Orthodox monasteries.
Wow. So in just a few centuries, monasteries were popping up everywhere, from Ireland to China.
That's right. And that takes us right into the heart of the medieval period.
Yeah. And speaking of the medieval period, I was amazed by the daily schedule in those European monasteries. It was rigorous.
It was. The entire day was structured around prayer. They had specific times for each service, from matins at dawn to compline before bed.
And that wasn't all, right? They also had work and contemplation woven throughout the day.
Exactly. And the work wasn't just busy work. Monks played a crucial role in preserving knowledge through copying manuscripts.
Right, those scriptoria, like the intellectual powerhouses of the Middle Ages.
Exactly. And of course, there was the physical labor, too. Tending gardens, farming, maintaining the buildings. It was a life of both spiritual and practical engagement.
Yeah, they had their hands full.
Yeah.
But they still had to eat, right? I read this really interesting detail about the refectory, the dining hall. The monks ate in silence, using sign language to communicate.
It does paint a vivid picture, doesn't it? The austerity and discipline of that life.
It really does. And what I found interesting was that this tradition of seating by seniority from the refectory, it actually continued in places like Oxford and Cambridge, long after the medieval period.
Oh, that's right. It's like a little echo of that monastic past.
Yeah, a connection between those worlds of scholarship and faith.
And, thinking about all this, it seems clear that monasteries were far more than just places of prayer.
Absolutely.
They were really at the heart of their communities, providing hospitality to travelers, sometimes even medical care, and their role in education especially. Some even evolved into universities.
They were vital institutions in many ways.
And let's not forget their influence on music. I read about this monk named Notker of St. Gall. He was a pioneer in developing early musical notation. Right. And that notation spread through the network of monasteries had a huge impact. It really revolutionized music.
Amazing. It's like these communities fostered both spiritual and artistic growth.
Yeah.
Incredible.
It really is.
And over time, monasteries themselves became destinations.
Exactly. They became pilgrimage sites, drawing people seeking spiritual solace, connection, or even just a break from the world.
Yeah, like places of refuge.
Exactly. And as their libraries grew, they attracted scholars and families seeking blessings. Some families even donated sons to the monastic life.
Wow. So they were really central to the social fabric of the time.
They were. And we're starting to see a trend here, aren't we? There were all sorts of different monasteries, even within Christianity.
You're right. Like the sources mention the Benedictines, known for their emphasis on manual labor, and then there were the Cistercians, a more austere order focused on solitude.
Exactly. And those are just two examples. There's a whole fascinating world of different monastic orders to explore.
Oh, definitely. Tell me more about them.
There are so many. You've also got the Carthusians, known for their extreme solitude, each monk living in a separate hermitage within the monastery. And then you have the mendicant orders, like the Franciscans.
Oh, right. The mendicant order. They were the ones who went out into the world, right?
Exactly. They still lived a communal life, but their focus was on serving the poor and preaching. They were very much engaged with the world outside the monastery walls.
It's amazing how, even within one religion, you have this whole spectrum of monastic expression, from hermits to highly structured communities to those actively working in the world.
It really shows the diverse ways people sought to live out their faith, how they dedicated their lives to something bigger. But it's not just about Catholicism. Your sources also mention Eastern Orthodox monasteries.
Yes, I was curious about that. Seems like a similar concept, but I wondered if there are any key differences between, Catholic and Eastern Orthodox monasticism.
Well, the emphasis on ascetic discipline and communal living, that's shared. But Eastern Orthodoxy doesn't have separate orders like in Catholicism, like the Benedictines or Franciscans.
So no designated groups with specific rules or focuses.
No.
Interesting. So how do they distinguish between different types of monasteries then?
They categorize them based on, their level of communal living. There's the cenobium.
The cenobium.
Yeah, that's where monks live, work, and pray together under the guidance of an abbot. Then there are the sketes. Smaller communities, they allow for a bit more individual practice but still gather for services. And of course, you still have hermits living in solitary retreat.
So even within that tradition, you have that same spectrum, from communal to solitary. It's like a universal element of monasticism,
Yeah.
regardless of the religion. But speaking of Eastern Orthodoxy, you can't talk about that without mentioning Mount Athos.
Oh, Mount Athos. This place is incredible. It's an isolated peninsula in Greece, home to 20 monasteries, and they operate almost like well, a monastic republic. It's entirely self-governing.
Yeah.
And they have this tradition that makes it so unique. No women allowed.
Yeah. It's been that way for centuries, hasn't it?
It has. It's like stepping back in time, a place full of history and tradition
Hmm.
and, a distinct spiritual atmosphere.
And Oriental Orthodox churches have some seriously old monasteries too, don't they?
They do. Monasteries like St. Macarius and St. Anthony in Egypt, they're considered some of the oldest in the world, dating back to the very early days of Christianity.
It's amazing to think those communities are still active today,
Yeah.
centuries later. But you know what really surprised me was learning about Protestant monasticism. I always associated monasteries with Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy.
It's definitely lesser known, yeah,
Yeah.
but it's there. It started gaining traction in the late 18th century. Groups like the Shakers, they embraced communal living and celibacy.
Right.
And it continued throughout the 19th century, often with a focus on social reform.
And some of those Protestant communities were really pushing boundaries, weren't they? There was even mention of experimental monasteries in the 1960s, the ones where men and women lived together and marriage and family were permitted.
Yeah. It was a pretty radical departure from traditional monasticism, reflecting the changing social landscape of the time. Another example of how that monastic impulse adapts.
And it seems that impulse is having a bit of a resurgence today, even outside traditional religions, with, the rise of neo-monasticism.
It is. People forming intentional communities, drawing inspiration from monastic values,
Hmm.
simplicity, service, community. They might not take vows or wear robes, but they're looking for a way of life that prioritizes something beyond just material success and individual ambition.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered Christian monasticism in quite a bit of depth. But what about those other traditions, like
What
Hindu monasteries?
Good point. In Hinduism, they use the term matha for monastery. These institutions often serve as centers of spiritual learning and practice, transmitting the teachings of specific lineages or gurus.
Right. And those have a long history too, right?
They do. Some of the most important ones were established by Adi Shankara back in the 8th century, and those mathas are still going strong. There's the Ramakrishna Math, known for its focus on service to humanity, and the Imar Matha, which is a prominent pilgrimage site. They're vital centers of Hindu religious life.
It's like each matha is its own little world, reflecting the diversity of Hindu tradition. Now, what about Jain monasteries?
Jain monasteries use the term vihara, the same term as Buddhists.
Oh, interesting.
And just like in those traditions, Jain monks and nuns dedicate their lives to spiritual discipline and nonviolence, seeking liberation from the cycle of rebirth.
It's fascinating that the same term, vihara, is used across multiple traditions. It's a shared understanding of what that space represents, a place apart dedicated to a spiritual path. But this next one really threw me for a loop, Sufi monasteries. I thought Islam discouraged monasticism.
You're right. Mainstream Islam generally does reject the idea of monasticism, but the term Sufi refers to Muslim mystics. They often formed brotherhoods centered around a particular teacher or path, though they didn't necessarily live in secluded communities.
So it's more about a shared spiritual journey than physical separation.
Exactly. It's a different expression of that monastic impulse, focused on inner transformation within everyday life.
Wow. It's really incredible how this one concept, this yearning for a life dedicated to something beyond the everyday, has shown up in so many different forms.
It's a universal human longing.
Sure.
And it's not just a historical phenomenon either. Monasteries continue to capture our imaginations today, even in literature.
Oh, you're right. One of the sources you sent mentioned The Monk, that Gothic novel.
Uh-huh.
It uses a monastery as the backdrop to critique Catholicism. And there's Northanger Abbey, which reflects on the dissolution of monasteries in England. And then there's Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. It's like a profound exploration of Orthodox monastic life and the role of the elders, those wise figures who guide others. It seems like monasteries, in all their forms, continue to intrigue us, offering a glimpse into different ways of seeking meaning and purpose, and that sense of separation from the world, of intentional simplicity. It holds a certain appeal, even for those of us who aren't monks or nuns.
I think so.
But there was also something about a warming house, in medieval European monasteries. What was that about?
Oh, right. The warming house was typically the only room with a fire. It really highlights the austerity of monastic life, but also the monks' practicality. They still needed to stay warm during those harsh winters, even while embracing a life of simplicity.
A good reminder that even those seeking a spiritual life, they're still human, right?
Right.
And speaking of practicality, your sources also highlighted how monasteries weren't just about prayer. They were often centers of practical knowledge, particularly when it came to agriculture and medicine.
Absolutely. The Benedictine motto, ora et labora, prayer and work, sums it up perfectly. They weren't just contemplatives, they were active participants in the world, using their knowledge to benefit themselves and their communities.
Yeah. And that work often had an impact beyond the monastery walls too, didn't it? I remember reading that monasteries played a vital role in preserving classical texts during the Dark Ages. They made sure that knowledge wasn't lost.
That's right, they were like these islands of learning, safeguarding those precious texts, transmitting them to future generations. And as their libraries grew, they attracted scholars from far and wide, contributing to the eventual revival of learning in Europe. You could even say they laid the foundation for the universities we have today.
Wow. So they weren't just preserving the past, they were shaping the future. That's pretty amazing. But what about the monasteries of today? Are they still relevant in the modern world? In a society that often seems to prioritize speed and efficiency and constant connection, what's their place?
That's the question, isn't it? It seems like monasteries are at a crossroads. I mean, the world has changed so much, and yet these ancient institutions are still here.
Yeah,
They represent a way of life that, well, a lot of people find really appealing these days.
I could see that.
It's like they offer a blueprint for, slowing down,
Yeah.
simplifying, connecting with something deeper.
Right. Beyond all the noise and demands of modern life.
Exactly. And it's not just about escaping the world either. Historically, monasteries have been centers of social change, activism even.
That's true. Like those Christian monasteries that promoted literacy back in the Middle Ages.
Exactly. Or the Buddhist monks who are involved in peace movements and environmental activism today.
Oh, and those experimental Protestant communities we talked about earlier, pushing boundaries back in the 60s. It's like that impulse to engage with the world is part of the whole monastic idea, too.
I think it is. It's about finding that balance between contemplation and action, between inner peace and working to make the world better, a more just and compassionate place.
So maybe we all need a little bit of that monastic wisdom in our lives, even if we don't live in a monastery.
Maybe so.
It's not about renouncing the world, but finding ways to live more intentionally.
Or mindfully.
Right. Like incorporating practices like meditation or mindfulness into our routines, or finding ways to serve our communities. Contribute to something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. Taking those monastic values, simplicity, service, community, and finding ways to apply them to our modern lives.
Yeah, finding ways to live a more meaningful life, even amidst all the chaos.
And maybe that's part of what draws us to monasteries in the first place. They represent a possibility, an alternative way of being.
Yeah. It's been amazing exploring all this material on monasteries. Thank you so much for guiding me through it all. And to everyone listening, thank you for sharing your sources with us. We hope you found this exploration of monasteries thought-provoking. And as you continue to learn about them, think about this. In a world that often feels fragmented and overwhelming, what can we learn from those who chose a different path? A path of simplicity, community, and dedication to something bigger than themselves. Maybe the monasteries, in all their forms, hold some answers to the questions we're all asking today.